It was Valentine's Day, and it was just when Oscar Pistorius had murdered his girlfriend. I was on a square in Bristol, which has big TV screens showing like the live stream of this news and his house. And I had a megaphone and I jumped up onto this bench and I just started bellowing like violence against women statistics into this square. I was really angry. I would not do that now because that would be trespass on this public-private space, or it would be serious disruption, it would be noisy, and things that I used to do without even thinking about it as an activist suddenly no longer feel like a safe option to do.
Welcome to this week's edition of In Solidarity, where we will be unpacking how our right to protest in the UK is being severely compromised. Today we are joined by Sian Norris, feminist activist and senior investigative reporter at openDemocracy, who for the last 6 months has been looking into how recently passed legislation, including the Public Order Act of 2023 and the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act of 2022, have been rolling back our rights. According to these acts, protests can be preemptively stopped on subjective suspicion, and you may not even have intention to actually protest to be reasonably accused of doing so. This affects all of us. Sian's investigation shines a light on the how. How exactly these laws collect all of us into an increasingly undemocratic dragnet. Sian, welcome back to the podcast. You were in my chair last week talking to Nasreen Parvaz on women's fight for freedom in Iran. And now today we'll be talking about our freedoms here in the UK. Let's start at the beginning. Why did you decide to pursue this investigation?
So openDemocracy won a grant from the Legal Education Forum to have a look at the ways in which anti-democratic legislation passed by the Conservative Party had impacted all of our democratic rights and human rights in general. And I realised that the anti-protest legislation that had been passed by the sort of previous Conservative governments, first led by Boris Johnson and then by Truss and then Rishi Sunak, not only impacted the democratic rights of people involved in protests, but had this much bigger ripple effect on all of us. The protest legislation was so much more fundamental in how everyone could be harmed, everyone could be affected, even if they're not a protester, even if they don't think of themselves as a protester. And so I was really keen to sort of see how these anti-democratic moves and anti-democratic laws were going beyond the initial targets of that legislation in a way that arguably the immigration legislation, was on a specific target and kind of stayed there.
I was wondering if you could give a sense of what sort of work goes into carrying out an investigation like this.
Yeah, so as you said in your introduction, this investigation has really taken about 6 months. I start off with all of my investigations. I have the same process. I pose a hypothesis. What is the thing I want to find out? What is the thing that I believe is happening that needs to be proven? And my hypothesis for this one was that, let me read it to you. We used to have people at protests who could volunteer to be arrestables. Now we're all arrestables. This investigation hypothesizes that the new laws, the anti-protest laws, had an immediate and catastrophic effect on civil liberties, and that affected all of us, not just the targets of the people who go on protest, the targets of the legislation. So once I had my hypothesis, I needed to get hold of some data. How did I know that these laws were effective? Perhaps these laws had been passed, but nobody was really touched by them. Perhaps they weren't even being implemented properly. And so I sent freedom of information requests to all of the police forces in England and Wales, asking them about the number of arrests that they had made for specific offences that had been introduced by the Public Order Act of 2023 and the Police Crimes and Sentencing and Courts Act in 2022. And then, I have to wait 20 working days to get that data, and it tends to take longer than 20 working days from some police forces, and analyse it. And I was, at the same time as waiting to get the data, I just wanted to talk to as many people as possible who had been impacted by these laws. So I got in touch with people from Extinction Rebellion, from people involved in Gaza and Palestine solidarity campaigns, people involved in Just Stop Oil and other climate activism. I started talking to them about how they were finding the laws were changing the ways that they protested or causing harm to their democratic rights.
I'm curious about the specific people you interviewed because from reading the piece, obviously, I know that there's probably so much more that didn't make it into the final copy. But I guess first, you mentioned PCSC. Can you catch us up on what that is? And then also the Public Order Act of 2023. Like, what do they cover? What do these acts entail?
So, the Police Crimes Sentencing and Courts Act, the PCSC, such a mouthful, both the acronym and the law itself, um, was passed as a response to, well, basically, the PCSC covered a whole host of different criminal justice legislation. It looked at changing sentences for various criminal offences. It looked at police powers. It looked at creating new offences. And the protest action was just a small part of a much bigger legislative project on criminal justice. But the bit that I was interested in was the sort of anti-protest stuff. And yeah, they kind of changed definitions on what serious disruption meant when it comes to protest. So they introduced new offences that allowed the police to impose any type of condition on a public procession or public assembly if it was necessary to prevent significant impact on persons or prevent serious disruption. And that disruption could be by noise, it could be by disorder, it could be by damage to property. And it created this offence of intentionally or recklessly causing public nuisance, which is really key to some of the people that I interviewed for this story. It created an offence of willful obstruction to a highway, and it imposed new conditions on one-person protests. And that condition is, again, mainly related to noise and disruption. I think the kind of one-person protest that everybody knows about is Steve Bray, the Stop Brexit man outside Parliament, who stands there with his loudspeaker and shouts Stop Brexit all day. And a new legislation kind of imposed new restrictions on that kind of activity. There were other parts of the PCSE which were important, so the introduction of buffer zones around abortion clinics, and some other areas of protest, but those were the kind of main bits that I looked at. The Public Order Act came a little bit after the PCSE, and basically the Public Order Act tried to do what the PCSE wasn't able to do. So a lot of the new offences that were planned for in the PCSE didn't get passed. And so the government came back with a new piece of legislation, the Public Order Act. And this is where you got the criminalisation of what's known as locking on. So locking on might be that you attach yourself to a piece of infrastructure. It might be that you've attached yourself to another person in order to kind of perform a protest. It created the offence of being equipped to lock on. So if a police officer sees you with some ties or handcuffs or bike locks, and they think that you're going to use that to lock yourself to some infrastructure or a person or whatever it is, then they can have grounds to arrest you. They had new offences against tunnelling in the Public Order Act. So I'm sure a lot of listeners will remember there was a big tunnelling protest on HS2 by Euston. And so the Public Order Act introduced offences around that. Obstruction of major transport works, so blocking, motorways, things like that, interfering with key infrastructure, and then new powers around stop and search. So obviously we have, again, listeners will be familiar with stop and search powers, this idea that police can stop you and search you if they think you're up to no good. And there's a lot of discussion about the racialized nature of stop and search. These new powers allow for stop and search specifically around the protest legislation. So a police officer, if he thinks that you're going to be committing a protest offence, now has the right to stop and search you to check that you're not going to be doing that. So again, the other thing that was quite interesting about the Public Order Act is that it introduced what's known as a serious disruption prevention order, which means that if the police or the Home Office thinks you're going to cause serious disruption by a protest, they can stop you from doing that in advance. But I sent freedom of information requests to all the police forces in England and Wales, and to be fair, none of them had used that prevention order in the time period that I asked. It doesn't mean that they won't use it in the future, but I didn't manage to get any sort of positive data on that, which, again, it's an interesting one because does that mean they're not using the powers because people aren't doing these protests that could cause serious disruption, or is it because they haven't used the powers for other reasons? But I think the Public Order Act, it introduced a lot more legislation than the PCSE did, and a lot more draconian legislation, and has had a real impact on people's ability to protest.
So, what was considered to be a serious disruption before these acts, or was this not a concept in any legislation before to have serious disruptions that could be legally prevented?
So one of the big issues with serious disruption is that it was very loosely defined, and it's a really subjective thing. So it says in the legislation, about noise. Well, what what is noisy to one person might be fine to another person, might be a nightmare for someone else. It's really difficult to kind of nail down what serious disruption means. And obviously, we know, like, if you block a motorway and no food deliveries can get back, that is obviously serious disruption. Whether you want to criminalize that or not is the question of this legislation. But I think one of the big issues is that it's such a loose phrase and it's very difficult to know or to judge when serious disruption is actually happening. And that's why, in the end, I think that that particular part of the legislation was subject to a legal challenge because of this kind of loose definition, and a subjectiveness to the definition that means, one police officer interpretation of that could be different from someone else's.
When you were first describing these acts and what they mean for protesters, at first it sounded like they would only affect people who are doing sort of extreme or what annoying protests, annoying in air quotes for, people complain about protesters blocking the highways and they're trying to get to work and they might lose out on money for that. But it sounds like these affect anyone who is interested in protesting or is involved in any campaign, or even when you're talking about people who look like they could be preparing to lock on. In theory, if I was near a protest and I was cycling and I had a bike lock, I could be considered as someone who's intending to lock myself to some sort of infrastructure. So it sounds like it could affect many people, not just like what we might think of as more disruptive protests.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's the exact issue with a lot of this legislation. Um, I mean, first of all, protest is meant to be disruptive. Like, that is the point. I I used to be I am a feminist activist, but I used to be a, proper feminist activist who organized protests, and who, took part in public actions. And we used to organize Reclaim the Night marches in Bristol, where we would slow down traffic because we would be a huge group of women and some male allies taking up the pavement and spilling into the road and, getting in the way of people and being disruptive, because that's what protest has to be. You want to make a lot of noise. You want to let people know that you're angry or campaigning for something. You want to stop traffic because then people will be like looking at your placards and engaging and hopefully supporting what you're saying. But even if they're not supporting with it, you kind of want to get those people angry. So this idea that the only kind of acceptable protest is one that doesn't cause any disruption or annoy anyone or get in the way of anything is a really slippery slope in itself. Um, One of the things I mentioned in the article, again going back to my own sort of protesting days, is when I remember it really well. It was V-Day, which was, Valentine's Day, and it was just when Oscar Pistorius's part had murdered his girlfriend. I mean, at the time we didn't know that he murdered her, although it was pretty clear what had happened. And I was on a square in Bristol, which has big TV screens on the walls, showing the news and like the live stream of this news and his house. And I had a megaphone and I jumped up onto this bench and I just started bellowing like violence against women statistics into, this square. Now that kind of thing, I didn't even think about doing that. at that point. I think it was 2014. I had my megaphone, I was shouting, I was really angry. I was like, I was doing this in one of those odd places which is public but is actually privately owned. So, you're not really supposed to climb on the benches and start shouting at people. And this one really came into my mind because I was like, I would not do that now because that would be trespass on this public private space, or it would be serious disruption, or it would be noisy. And things that I used to do without even thinking about it as an activist suddenly no longer feel like a safe option to do. And you use the example of like having a bike lock. Again, I think that was something that really was in my mind when I was doing this investigation. Like, if you walk past a protest or someone who is locked on and you have a bike lock or you have some rope for for whatever reason, because you've got some DIY to do, um, you suddenly are equipped to lock on and you're suddenly vulnerable. And we know that people have been wrongfully arrested as a result of these laws. So there was a pro-monarchy person who was mistaken for someone in Just Stop Oil and was arrested at some kind of royal event. It might have been a coronation. Um, an LBC journalist was arrested while covering a Just Stop Oil protest. So suddenly you could be, you know, in a vicinity of something happening and you fall under suspicion. But also the people who are doing the activism, who are doing the protests, they shouldn't be under suspicion either, because you should be able to jump up on a bench with a loudspeaker and talk about violence against women and girls without thinking that you're going to get arrested.
Your hypothesis for this investigation was that we are all arrestables now. Can you explain what that term means? And has it always been important in activists and campaigning circles? And is it more important now since these acts have come into place, or is it kind of obsolete if you think that we might all be arrestables now?
Really like that term because it was something that someone from Extinction Rebellion said to me. Like, we used to have arrestables and we're all arrestables now. And the idea is, and I'm going to use my own personal experience again from feminist activism. We once took part in a UK Uncut action against tax evasion and domestic abuse. And the idea was that you would sort of invade a business, I don't know say which one, which had kind of complicated tax affairs. And we were saying, like all these big businesses are sort of have, not paying the right amount of tax while domestic abuse services are being cut to shreds. And we worked out that you could have 3 layers of involvement. You could write a letter to your MP about this situation. You could go to the business and hand out flyers to members of the public, or you could do the invasion, like, and occupy the business. But that meant you were at risk of arrest because that would be like aggravated trespass or trespass. And that way, we made it really clear that anyone could get involved in this protest. And if you didn't want to get arrested, you could just do the letter writing or the flyering. I've never been arrested. I didn't want to get arrested. So I flyered. Other people were happy to risk arrest and went and occupied the business. Now, there's not a sense of like some people can volunteer for the more extreme action and be at risk of arrest, because everyone is at risk of arrest. So things that, everyone is now an arrestable. And I think, as you say, it makes the term obsolete because, if you're considered as causing disruption, and, you could be causing disruption by standing outside a doorway to a business giving out flyers, that's disruptive, then you are at risk. And so the idea that you would be able to take part in protests at a level that is right for you has sort of been done away with, because now people are very scared and nervous that even taking part in what we would used to have considered a slightly more passive way or safer way is no longer a protection against arrest.
Do you think that there are certain kinds of protests, like for certain topics or demographics of the people who may be protesting, that are more at risk? Or do you think the risk is similar across the board.
Absolutely not similar across the board. So we know that there were specific kinds of protests that were in the previous government's mind when they passed the PCSC and the POA, because they said so. So when Priti Patel, who was Home Secretary at the time of the PCSC being introduced, when she introduced the bill to Parliament, she named Extinction Rebellion, she named Black Lives Matter, um, and the other kind of associated climate activists as the reason why we need this legislation. So it feels very clear that climate, like climate anti-racist protesters were the kind of first target of this legislation, and that it was being introduced to try and combat the protesting activity of those groups. And I think that's only gotten worse since October the 7th, when we've seen, so many Gaza solidarity protests, that those protests have been really heavily policed. That said, there are examples of other forms of protests where there have been arrests, but I think it's really clear that the climate movement and the Black Lives Matter / Gaza solidarity movements were the primary target of this legislation. And I think, the anti-protest laws is a way of shutting down our democratic rights and saying that the only time you can engage with democracy is on election day, and that any other attempt is somehow illegitimate. The other thing that's happened is that there's been a conflation of protests with criminal behaviour. Now, last year, as we know, in the UK, we had these horrific riots, absolutely awful scenes of far-right and racist individuals doing what they called a protest, but were actually, setting fire to cars and, trying to set fire to hotels where asylum-seeking people are living. That's not a protest. That's just violence. That's like criminal damage and criminal violence against marginalised communities. And so, I think we have to be able to define what is harmful and dangerous and criminal behaviour against what is protest. And what I'm worried that these laws do is almost blur that line, so that all activity is seen as bad and criminal, as opposed to people exercising their democratic right and engaging with democracy versus, criminal damage and riots and intimidation and harassment, which is what we saw last summer.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it seems like you said that when these acts were, I guess, proposed, they were specifically referring to BLM or Extinction Rebellion. Were they also referring to protests where people were burning cars or threatening to burn down buildings?
No. One of the things that I found really interesting when I was looking at the Hansard transcripts of the House of Lords debates for the Public Order Act was a comment by Baroness Fox, who, is not someone you'd necessarily think of as being on the side of XR. I mean, she's definitely not on this pro XR or pro BLM. She's kind of known for being sort of anti-woke, but she's also known for being a libertarian and therefore in favour of protest. And she was saying that she'd spoken to people who were didn't seem to understand that these laws weren't just against Extinction Rebellion, or these laws weren't just against Black Lives Matter, that they would be against the things that those people were in favour of protesting too. So she used the examples of people protesting against low traffic neighbourhoods in their towns, and sort of people going, oh no, that won't be affected because this is about XR, it's not about our protest, it's not about what we want to protest on. And I think it was a really wise comment, and I don't think I'd say that about Claire Fox. But it was a really smart insight, because it's all what the government did when passing this legislation is that they created a narrative of us versus them. Like, if you are annoyed by XR, if you're annoyed by BLM, if you didn't think the Colston statue should have been toppled, then we're on your side, and those hippies, those crusties, those Marxists are against you. Um, but of course, any protest is covered by these laws. Anyone who wants to protest on anything is covered by these laws. And so, yeah, it created a sort of confusion in the public about who was being targeted and who's going to get into trouble. But technically, if you want to protest against a low traffic neighborhood and you stand in the middle of the road and stop them putting in the bollards, you're causing serious disruption and you could be arrested. So, one of the things that I really wanted to get to when I wrote this piece is that it's not just the democratic harms of denying us the right to protest or making it so much harder to protest and therefore making it harder for us to engage in democracy. It was also the democratic harms of creating this division in society of like, who's on whose side and that a certain group of people can be criminalized because we don't like what they stand for and but we'll be on your side, the kind of and I think that's been really problematic.
So these two acts, the PCSC and the Public Order Act 2023, they were put in place under the conservatives. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So since the conservatives see themselves as a party promoting free speech and protecting free speech, how did they negotiate that, I guess, principle of their party with this crackdown on protests?
I mean, that's been one of the craziest things about this whole anti-protest legislation is that the Conservatives were like, we're not like those cancel culture woke snowflakes. You know? We're the people of free speech and liberty, and we're the even gosh, when you think about during the COVID lockdowns and how Boris Johnson resisted it because British people would never stand for such an affront against their liberty, and then we're like, oh, but we're going to ban protest. Like, we're going to make it really difficult for you to have a protest. Um, and I think it goes back to my previous answer as well. They squared that circle by creating be creating culture war and saying that the people who go on protests are like the tofu eating wokerati, to coin the Suella Braverman phrase, or they're the sort of snowflakes who um, don't understand the importance of the economy, and that we're standing up for the good, hardworking man who, doesn't want to be disrupted, and we're on your side. And so they almost created a situation where the people on protests were the ones that were anti-free speech, or, the sort of woke snowflake thing where they muddled it all up into this idea of what that meant and that they were the ones standing up for British values. And I think that's how they squared that circle. But one of the really interesting outcomes of all of this is that the PCSE introduced the buffer zones around abortion clinics, which I actually support. Um, and that means that around an abortion clinic, there's a certain area where people can't have protests. And it means that women going to reproductive healthcare appointments don't get hassled and harassed by people, anti-abortion protesters. I think that's a good use of anti-protest law. People can go and have an anti-abortion protest wherever they like, just don't do it when someone's going to get a healthcare appointment. And a lot of the Conservative MPs who voted for the PCSE, who voted for all these restrictions on protests, who voted for the Public Order Act, absolutely up in arms about the buffer zones, and they're saying it's an assault on freedom of speech. And even when they tried to introduce buffer zones in a previous vote in 2020, it didn't get through because it was against freedom of speech and against liberty and against the right to protest. And I tracked the whole time who was like saying that in the House about buffer zones, and then happily went through the voting lobby to vote through all these restrictions on protests. It's all the same people. So they have a massive contradiction in their attitude and approach to free speech. And I think in a way, with the buffer zones example, it's kind of come back to bite them, because you can't say that you're in favor of this form of protest, which I don't think is protest, I think it's harassment, and then say that you can't, have a protest outside a Unilever building.
One of the sort of case studies in this investigation was a caroling service that ended up getting targeted by police. Could you tell us more about that? And without giving too much away of exactly everything that happened, but yeah, what stood out to you about that?
Yeah, so this came out because I was interviewing some people from XR, and they were like, you need to go and talk to the people that organise this carol service. And I was like, again, I mean, this has been a real new area of investigation for me. Um, and on 14th of December, a group of multi-faith and no-faith people organised a carol service that was a sort of vigil for Gaza. It had people from, Christians for Palestine, local Palestinian solidarity groups, Jewish activists, and they just got together to sing some carols. And it was not on Parliament Square, because that's where you do have to get permission, but it was on the corner on the street. So they, and I just think, like, gosh, I mean, when, again, it goes back to, like, when I was younger, like, how often did you just go carol singing at Christmas? You didn't think that you had to worry about where you were standing. And initially the police on the scene were like, yeah, that's fine, you can carry on. And then the organisers realised that police were sort of gathering and it was becoming a lot more hostile, and that they were asking them to disperse, and that they didn't have permission to stay on this street corner past 4:30 p.m. And it was really moving doing that interview, because I interviewed the three organisers, one of whom is a priest, one of whom is a Jewish activist, and one of whom was a Muslim woman and Palestinian activist. And you just really got that understanding of yeah, we are all arrestables now. Like, nobody was arrested, thankfully, but that they were so scared of being arrested, because suddenly something as harmless as gathering together to sing and read blessings in the poems was conceived as threatening. And one of the things that Helen, who was the priest, said to me, that she was almost like the threat came because it was interfaith, and that it's easier for people to want to see us divided and as against each other. And there was something threatening about Muslim people, Jewish people, Christian people, people of no faith, people of other faiths coming together with a shared cause and to show a shared humanity. And that's what people don't like. And I thought that was really profound, which, to think about it like that, because, it is easier for governments to control people when they're divided.
Since these acts were put into place under the Conservatives and now Labor is in power, why don't they, and why can't they just hit the undo button on these acts?
So I think one of the reasons that Labour haven't moved on this and haven't repealed these laws is that they do enjoy some popular support. And there's some polling that suggests that people are in favour of the anti-protest laws. And I think that's a real marker of the kind of successful narrative that the Conservatives and a lot of the right-wing press put forward about why these protest laws were being put in place and who the targets were. We also know that Labour continued with an appeal that was started by the Conservative Home Secretary James Cleverly around sort of a legal decision that found some of the serious disruption powers were unlawful. James Cleverly, when he was Home Secretary, appealed against that court ruling, and Yvette Cooper, when she became Home Secretary, continued with that appeal. So even when there was a possibility to accept the unlawful nature of some of the regulations that have been brought in, Labour continued to sort of fight the Conservative fight. And that is really disappointing. I do hope that Labour at some point looks at these laws and recognises that they are harmful to civil liberties, that they're harmful to democracy, and that it doesn't matter which political stripe you are, it doesn't matter what your political views are. Anything that criminalises the right to protest is harmful and harmful to democracy. And we need to defend the right to protest, and we need to defend our right to free speech and freedom of assembly. But there's one person I interviewed put it, if we don't do that, then how are we any better than authoritarian regimes?
To read Sian's investigation in full, head to openDemocracy.net. In Solidarity was produced by Carla Abreu, James Battisil, and Ayodeji Rutimwa. The theme song is Odyssey by Edward Abella. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if you've not already done so, then please do follow and subscribe. If you'd like to support us in our production of these episodes, you can do so at openDemocracy.net/donate. And finally, If you'd like to get more investigations like this from around the world, all produced by independent journalists without billionaire backers, then head to opendemocracy.net/newsletters. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.